I'm noticing that there's a lot of misunderstandings about what trauma-informed care actually is. And so in this video, I'm going to debunk 6 myths about trauma-informed care. Hey everybody, my name's Dr. Scott Giacomucci, and I'm a trauma therapist and educator and author of a recent book called Trauma-Informed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organization, Action Methods for Leadership. And this video is going to be focused on some of the misconceptions, some of the myths and misunderstandings about what trauma-informed care is. So the first myth that I want to debunk is that trauma-informed care is only for people with trauma. So this is false. Trauma-informed care is really for everybody. I like to tell the students and trainees and organizations that I consult for that if you're working with humans, you're working with trauma survivors. So trauma-informed care is really for everybody. Of course, it has the word trauma in it, and it's a framework and philosophy for creating optimal conditions in organizations and in the provision of services, any kind of service, for human beings to be their best and to receive care without being hurt and without being re-traumatized, as well as for humans to work in organizations and systems where they can be their best as staff members and volunteers without being hurt or without being re-traumatized in the workplace. So trauma-informed care is not only for people with identified trauma. Trauma-informed care is really for everybody. The second myth that I want to dispel is that trauma-informed care is only for therapists and mental health providers. So this is also wrong. Trauma-informed care emerged from the field of mental health and addiction treatment and trauma, but it really is for organizations and systems, and it's for every discipline and every industry. Again, trauma-informed care is a philosophy, a framework, a process of creating systems that allow human beings to be their best and to mitigate and prevent harm. So trauma-informed care can be implemented not just in treatment centers or in psychotherapy, but also in legal clinics and in hospital systems and in massage therapy and in government agencies and in corporate businesses. Trauma-informed care can be implemented anywhere and everywhere. And many government agencies are starting to require trauma-informed care, even outside of psychotherapy and treatment settings. Pennsylvania is actually a state that passed legislation several years ago to become a trauma-informed state and require every government agency across the board to implement some aspects of trauma-informed care. So, second myth is that trauma-informed care is not only for therapists and mental health providers. The reality is that it's really for everybody. And it's for systems, not just for individual practitioners. The third myth that I want to cover is that many people think trauma-informed care is a specific therapy or modality, which is just wrong. Trauma-informed care is not a modality. It's not a specific treatment approach. Trauma-informed care is a philosophy, and there's a bunch of different principles and guiding frameworks within trauma-informed care that can be incorporated into any psychotherapy approach and any modality or treatment. So we could take trauma-informed care principles and integrate it into cognitive behavioral therapy, or integrate it into group therapy or psychodrama, which is what my most recent book was focused on. But trauma-informed care by itself is not a modality. It's a larger framework that can be implemented and integrated within any modality. The fourth myth that I want to cover is that many people believe trauma-informed care means that we don't hold students or clients accountable, that people get away with whatever they're doing, and that there's so much flexibility that there's no accountability or responsibility. And this is simply untrue. The difference with trauma-informed care and other traditional approaches is that in trauma-informed care, we understand that many of the difficult behaviors or resistance is really caused by past trauma, or is a defense mechanism related to past trauma that an individual is using today to try to protect themselves, to try to keep themselves safe or secure, or to regulate emotions that they're experiencing or anxiety they're experiencing. And so instead of being overly rigid, trauma-informed care would guide us to be flexible, to be understanding, and to be compassionate. But being flexible and understanding and compassionate doesn't mean that we have no boundaries or that we never hold people accountable or responsible for their behaviors. It just means that we're able to hold boundaries with compassion and that we're flexible in the accountability that we provide and the boundaries that we set. That being super rigid and applying boundaries and punishments or accountability in the same exact way for every single person across the board isn't always going to make sense. That people need different styles, different approaches, different types of boundaries, different ways of being held accountable. And so trauma-informed care really promotes flexibility rather than rigidness. And actually, rigidity is in many ways a symptom of trauma. Traumatized people, traumatized systems, traumatized families often demonstrate an over-reliance on rigidity or are overly chaotic. These being two opposites of the same spectrum, two extremes. And that what we're looking for is a balance in the middle there, that we're flexible, we're not overly rigid, but we're not overly chaotic either. So in trauma-informed care, we really value choice and control, predictability and thoughtful consequences rather than punitive punishments. And again, we're informed by the research about trauma to really understand that past adversity can be an underlying fueling factor of the reasons why individuals might act out or might be unable to fulfill commitments that they have made. And so we're flexible. We offer empathy and compassion. So this is the fourth myth that I wanted to debunk, and that I heard recently from someone that their problem with trauma-informed care as an addictions professional is that there's no accountability in trauma-informed care. And this is simply not true. The fifth myth that I want to debunk about trauma-informed care is that in trauma-informed care, we catharsis. We avoid bringing clients to difficult material where they might cry or experience a release. And this is simply not true. As trauma-informed practitioners, we do value catharsis, although we don't believe that it's the primary source of change usually. And we believe that facilitating catharsis needs to be done safely, responsibly, gradually, and with choice from the client. So we don't force catharses, we don't prioritize catharsis as the most important aspect of the healing, and we don't jump right into catharsis in trauma-informed care or treatments that are trauma-informed. We first begin by building safety, by building a relationship, by connecting with strengths. Sometimes in the course of that, a client may experience catharsis, and sometimes it's really meaningful and healing catharsis in connecting with strengths and safety and cohesion and building relationships. But the focus on facilitating catharsis comes after safety has been established, after the client has been resourced and is able to connect with strengths and has demonstrated that they can utilize different coping skills and understand what's happening for them. Then we move towards the trauma, the difficult emotions, the rage, the grief, the anger, the shame, the sadness. And this is usually where the bulk of the catharsis is going to be experienced and released in the process of trauma-informed treatment. And then after that, we don't just stop there, but we move towards integration and focusing on growth or post-traumatic growth after processing the trauma, after experiencing catharsis. So it's simply not true that we avoid catharsis in trauma-informed care. Instead, we focus on building safety and strengths to make sure that when we get to trauma processing and catharsis, that we're not unknowingly causing harm for the client or re-traumatizing the client by going too deep into catharsis too quickly. So we thoughtfully and gradually work with catharsis. And so the sixth myth about trauma-informed care that I want to debunk is, and it's two myths in one here. The idea that either we avoid trauma processing or that we require trauma processing is untrue. So this is the sixth myth, or what I'm calling the sixth myth about trauma-informed care, that we either require trauma processing or that we avoid it entirely out of fear of re-traumatization. So instead of requiring someone to talk about their trauma, we really emphasize choice and empowerment, which is the fifth of the trauma-informed principles. We emphasize the autonomy of the client. We allow them to lead us in trauma-informed care, and we do not require someone to talk about something they're not ready to talk about. I think this is one of the areas where clients are prone to experiencing harm and even re-traumatization in therapy, when the therapist believes that in order for someone to heal, they've got to talk about that trauma, and they've got to do it soon, and they've got to do it now. And it leads to therapists pushing clients outside of their window of tolerance and talking about something they're not ready to talk about just yet. I feel like this often happens in assessment, that in our attempt to collect information about the history of a client, oftentimes for the insurance company, we end up asking about trauma in the very first session before a client feels safe and connected and trusting. And I think this is problematic. It would be better to wait until a relationship has been formed before asking a client to talk about their trauma, and to really give them the choice about when and about how they want to talk about their trauma. So in providing trauma-informed care, I'm going to really affirm that the client gets to choose when we talk about their trauma, that we're not going to jump right into it, that if they're not ready to talk about something, or they don't want to get into the specific details of the trauma, that they don't have to, that we'll save that for when they feel ready to. Of course, I'll encourage them to face the trauma and deal with it, but only once I feel like we've established a bit of a relationship, some safety, some connection, and it feels like the client has the internal strengths and external supports to do that, and not before then. The other part of this myth is the idea that some people think trauma-informed care means that we completely avoid trauma processing in order to avoid the potential risks involved of re-traumatization or causing harm or triggering the client. And so this is not true either. We do not avoid trauma processing entirely in trauma-informed care, but we take our time. We don't force it, and we don't dive into it before a client is ready to engage in trauma processing. Instead, we thoughtfully assess and evaluate when a client is ready to do trauma processing. So we start with building safety, teaching coping skills, providing education, establishing that relationship, and then we move into the trauma processing. So there's structure in how we're reprocessing trauma so that we don't move into it too quickly. So this is what I'm calling the sixth myth of trauma-informed care. So in this video, we've talked a bit about what trauma-informed care is and what it is not. If you wanted to learn more about the specifics of what trauma-informed care is, I'd encourage you to check out some of the other videos on this channel. Specifically, the video about the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, where I outline the general framework of what trauma-informed care is, that in trauma-informed care, we realize the widespread impact of trauma, we recognize the signs and symptoms of past trauma showing up today in the present, we respond through our practices, policies, and procedures, and the 4th R is that we resist re-traumatization. And another video, another framework within trauma-informed care that provides a nice overview and definition of it is the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. I'm not going to go through them in detail here because it's outlined in other videos on the channel, but briefly, the 6 principles are safety, trust and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and issues related to identity, and specifically gender, history, and culture. So these are the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. I hope you found this video helpful and useful. If you did, I'd encourage you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, tell us what you found helpful or clarifying in this video, or if you feel like I missed one of the myths of trauma-informed care, I'd be really curious to hear about some of the other misconceptions and misunderstandings about trauma-informed care that you're aware of. Go ahead and put that in the comment section, and we look forward to hearing from you.